Hello and welcome to Top Shelf Books. If you're joining us for the first time, we are hopefully going to add some new books to your TBR, familiar favorites as well as something new. And we are continuing from episode 10 where we started to talk about the Western. So still going with the Western. All right, I promise this is my final episode for now dedicated to the Western, unless you all pop up and say that you just really want another one. But at this point, I hope if you have been following me, well, for one, I'm impressed that you've stuck it out, especially if you really don't want to read a Western. But I hope that you have found something at this point to add to your life and also have developed an appreciation for just how versatile the Western is. And we are going to continue with a few more categories today. So, one of the things that you can find in the Western, inevitably, is the concept of vigilante justice. It shows up in Lonesome Dove, which has been sort of my reference text throughout this discussion. The actions of Jake Spoon, and then which lead to vigilante justice unsuccessfully by July, who doesn't want to undertake such things. And then, of course, other characters go off on their own quest for justice as well. It was very difficult for me when creating this particular pair of books to leave out mention to Batman, though. He comes into my mind when I think of vigilante justice. But in the Western world, a good place to look for this topic is James Wade, All Things Left Wild, and it pairs very nicely with John Grisham's A Time to Kill. You will notice I like to pair Westerns and thrillers. Weirdly enough, as I have created these episodes, I have found that there is a strange overlap there. So if anyone's looking for potential academic paper fodder, the weird relationship between the Western and the thriller may be the place to go. Something else that the Western does really well, because there is a fascination with how the land changes over time and who inherits it and who is disinherited from particular places, whether those are Native Americans or the people that have come to take that land. The Western does the multi-generational saga really, really well. For those of you that are watching Yellowstone, it's doing something similar, and I don't think it's a coincidence. So if you want to look at the classic version of this, Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose is one of those Westerns that, if you have any interest in the genre, it is a great place to go. It is something to add to your list. I am really enjoying Philip Meyer's The Sun, although I think I mentioned to you in an earlier episode, I was listening to it on audiobook because I love Will Patton and I wish he did the audiobook of absolutely everything under the sun. But it was too gruesome for me to continue in audiobook format, so I have switched to the actual paperback. And then to make this list a little more inclusive, I also wanted to include Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. Not necessarily because of the connection to the West, but just if you want to pair your Western, if you start with one of these sagas, you might want to pair it with this one. Also, another title that should probably be mentioned here is Michener's Centennial, which looks at that area over a long stretch of time as well. Throughout our discussions of the Western, we've been kind of turning towards the idea of the frontier and challenging that notion. You can't really talk about the Western unless you talk about the notion of exploring the West and how people were drawn to that area because of the natural beauty there. So that is really handled very well in Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. You have a character from the East who is really not suited necessarily to going west. And one of my favorite things about Lonesome Dove is, in fact, there was no need to go west, right? Call just kind of gets a bee in his bonnet about this. And also the characters are older, so the idea of doing this epic trek into the west is made interesting by that. So again, another plug for Lonesome Dove. If you want the historical version of this, Frank McLynn's Wagons West is a good place to go. And then the very recently published, and of course it's also being broadcast right now, Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns' Blood Memory about the buffalo. And I wanted to include them because as we expanded into the West as a country, as settlers and immigrants expanded, one of the things that we did was destroy a great deal of the natural beauty of the West, and one of the symbols of that is the buffalo. Fortunately, good things were eventually done to help conserve these animals, but not until after so many of them were killed for absolutely no reason. If you are following along from the first episode, you will know that one of the things that I was talking about was that the Western is actually fairly unique, or it draws me to its uniqueness because it creates space for more characters than you would necessarily expect. We all want there to be better representation in literature. We all want to see ourselves, and I think the Western, compared to historical fiction in general, tends to have a wider cast. And one of the ways that it does this, we've already talked a little bit about cross-dressing. Even if we don't have directly, explicitly trans characters, we do have characters who are taking on other identities. They are experimenting with identities. So that's one thing that happens. We also get a fair amount of queer characters. And of course, the pinnacle of that, or the book you're going to find cited most often, is Brokeback Mountain, which became a film, the short story, the story collection. But I wanted to also point you towards a historical read, which is Queer Cowboys by Chris Packard. There are several titles that deal with romantic friendship, both in America and in England at this time period, but this is a good one to connect to the Western, and then you can expand outward. And if you want to see the same themes in fiction, Days Without End by Sebastian Barry is a good place to start. Women were also able to take on new identities by going west. Again, that promise of the frontier being a place where we could start over. And one of the books that I found that I was really excited about when I was doing research for this collection was Jana Bommersbach's Cattle Kate, which looks at this particular figure who her identity got changed in death to conform to the stories that men wanted to tell about her. So she took on certain aspects of an identity, but then things got done to her legend, which, as we know, is not unusual when it comes to outlaws. And with that, I wanted to pair The Historical Women and the Noose by Richard Clarke, and this is looking at female execution, because this is not something that I think we think about all that often, but because it comes up in Cattle Kate, I wanted to add a historical view as well. If you want something a little less grim, I suppose, Melissa Lenhart's Sawbones. The main character is facing the possibility of execution when the book opens, but she is going to move into the West and take on new skill sets, present skill sets that would typically be associated with male characters. In the first episode that I did about the Western, I talked about its unexpected connection to science fiction, and I mentioned that I'm rather a geeky person. So as I was putting together my discussion or my titles to talk about Mexico, I had to work really hard not to include the picture of Julian Bashir and Miles O'Brien because they play at the Alamo in the Holosuites, and I would like to argue, just in case anyone wants to give me a book on DS9, because I would like to do that someday, I think that what's happening there is they're auditioning for death because they are dealing with facing down a war, so they are playing at it to see sort of what it means. And of course, the Alamo has sort of a place in the American consciousness as well. So fictional versions, Winston Groom's El Paso and The Gates of the Alamo, both very good books on the topic. But if you want to get into the history, let me recommend the recently released Forget the Alamo, Brian Burrow, Chris Tomlinson, and Jason Stanford working together on that one, because it's really refreshing in this era where we are starting to question what monuments we have erected, what we hold to, what we want to go visit, and sort of, I don't think that we should just banish anything that is necessarily problematic, but studies like this get us to think about them differently. And I do think that that is worthwhile, and it's also just a really fun read. Also, there is the classic The General and the Jaguar, so Pershing's Hunt for Pancho Villa. So if you're wanting to dig into the historical actors and kind of the two key figures, I will confess, I probably shouldn't, but I'll tell you that the way that I was taught history when I was younger, it was sort of the great man version of history. And I'm always drawn to these titles that sort of, here is this big figure and how they impacted the world. So if you slap, Napoleon or Winston Churchill or something on the cover of a big history book, I'm just drawn to them. I know that it's not necessarily the way to do history, but they will come up occasionally in our discussion. So just apology for them. If I hadn't told you recently in our time together, I really am grateful for the opportunity to get to talk with you about books and also the opportunity to just dig into new things. So if I didn't have you to present material to, I wouldn't be nearly as excited to go on these. I think of them as sort of literary side quests. So there's what I'm reading, and then there's also the stuff I am pursuing so that we can have a good conversation together. And one of the books I found in our search was The Last Stand of Mary Goodcrow by Rachel Aaron. This is sort of a fantasy sci-fi version of the West, and it takes place in a mine. And I really wanted to find for you some interesting titles that deal with the mining history of the West, and I was not able to find something. So if you know something, I found more thrillers, but I did not find Westerns that dealt with this. But I did find Ghost Towns of the West, Philip Varney and Jim Hinckley, because the mining towns often became ghost towns. So I decided to make that our pairing for The Last Stand of Mary Goodcrow if you want to dig into the ghost towns. And I have not researched this myself, but I have heard that there are places that will pay you to come and stay in the ghost towns and act as tour guides. So potential gig. Live in the ghost town, hang out with the ghosts, see what you find out there. I've mentioned several times as we've had our discussion that the true history of the West and how many different figures it includes and how it gave new futures to people that maybe wouldn't have had them back east is really interesting to me. So when I found these particular titles, a line from Mel Brooks' Robin Hood Men in Tights came into my head. A black sheriff? It worked in Blazing Saddles. So introducing you, if you have not met him already through the recent television show, Bass Reeves is one of the famous African American figures of the West. And you can read about the fictional version of his story in Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, and this becomes the start of a trilogy, so you can keep reading. The historical version you can find in Black Gun, Silver Star, and it's so nice to see these aspects of history being told and retold and being looked at because 20, 30, 40 years ago, you would have just gotten a much more standard version of the West. And now I think today more people are more aware of how many people were contributing, Mexican voices and immigrant voices. So the Chinese that were working in the West, for example, the indigenous voices, African American voices, we're seeing a much livelier discussion, and that's better for readers everywhere. A few more titles that deal with race. Black Cowboys in the American West, and there are several titles that cover the same material, but I always try to find for you the ones that I feel really stand out. This one's a university press, so I'm going to trust their sources and they can direct you to even more sources. And then from the fiction side of things, the classic is The Color of Lightning, and a more recent publication, Life and Times of Persimmon Wilson, and characters in both of these novels coming up against questions of race and sometimes issues of racism in the West, and potentially pursuit from back east, because of course, depending on when you set your Western, you may have still had the fugitive slave laws in effect, and this could impact characters in the story. One of the main qualities of the West is, of course, the arid nature of it, and that is problematic when we think of ecological issues that it raises, especially as we deal with climate change and the increase in wildfires, things like that. A novel that deals with that arid landscape and what it means to not have enough water is Obret's Inland. And I love this one because we also get some unique creatures in it. A camel in the desert made me happy. A camel that obviously does not belong in the American West, right? And if you're looking for the more natural science, ecology discussion, the classic Water in the West by Norris Hundley Jr. has just been re-released. And then Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner is very popular. If you want a more classic Western that deals with this, The Time That It Never Rained is another title where we see characters confronting drought. One thing we don't see in Westerns, or at least I'm not aware of it, if you are, please let me know, is the occasional desert flood and how that can impact characters. And this is another thing I really love about Lonesome Dove is they are crossing different parts of the country, so they run into different aspects of weather and different challenges from the landscape. So it might be flooded river that they have to get cattle across, and then as they continue to move, snow has made things difficult. And then another place it could be raging heat. So the landscape is always really central to the Western and how the characters deal with it and acclimate themselves or fail to do so. I had mentioned that in television, the Western was really seeing a revival. And for me, one of the ways you can always tell in literature if something is undergoing sort of a renaissance is if it has made its way into YA literature, which is really a booming place these days. And I am grateful that it is, because when I was growing up, you only had a few genres of books that dealt with that age group, and you had to sort of be satisfied with what was on hand. So it's wonderful that we're seeing representative YA novels and that they're really growing. I would, of course, like to see some of the cool concepts that are dealt with in YA move their way back into adult novels because, again, I've mentioned before, it irritates me to no end that novels seem to think that everyone's life ends at 25. Another reason for cheering on the guys in Lonesome Dove, they have gray hair and they're still going into the West. You go, guys. So the YA novel I am going to propose for you for your Western consideration is Elysium Girls, and we have in it witchcraft, gambling gods, it's a very different magical West, and you can pair it, if you would like, with Jenny L. Walsh's fiction, A Betting Woman, about a character that goes pretty far west into San Francisco, in fact, and gets involved with the gambling there. I tried to find for you a history of gambling in the West because it's so central to the idea of the saloon and also cowboys in general. I wasn't able to find something that I was satisfied was worth your time. So if anyone knows of anything fiction or nonfiction, I'm still looking. The railroad is one of those key symbols of the West, and I don't know about you, but I find it really disappointing that America has turned away from large-scale public transport. Yes, I know there are some cities that have rails, but I have never lived close enough to them to take advantage, and it's just unfortunate that in an era of climate change, there are so many of us that we have to have cars in order to get to the places that we need to work. So 3 cheers for the return of the railroad, of course, without harming anyone in its reconstruction, because the original railroad, of course, took advantage of its laborers, and you can read about that if you would like in Stephen E. Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World, The Men Who Built the Transcontinental Railroad. And again, this is going to show you how wide the cast of characters in the West is. A new title for me, Ben Gally's Blood Rush, isn't necessarily about the railroad. It's a fantasy western, but the character finds himself in this untamed West, and one of the things that sort of fascinates him and that he has to contend with is the railroad. So I wanted to pair these two together for you. Again, I've been going with this theme of you dual wielding books as movie cowboys, but not the real thing, potentially would wield their pistols when they went out to their gunfights. I've already discussed the fact that thrillers and the Westerns seem to have a sort of sympathetic relationship, so I could have probably found you all sorts of books that deal with both fictionalized and true crime in the West. And I've actually already looked at Sherlock Holmes, weirdly enough, in this discussion. Who would have known that he would have come up twice in our discussion of the West? But one of the books I found when I was preparing to talk with you today was Holmes on the Range by Steve Hawkins Smith. And I was so intrigued with the idea of sort of the insight and the deduction of Holmes being applied to the West that I couldn't resist the opportunity to pass it along to you. And I also want to include or pair it with Murder at the Mission by Blaine Harden. Harden's book deals with how people are moved off of land and how murder was sometimes used to accomplish that. And that's also covered in Killers of the Flower Moon. It wasn't a rare thing, unfortunately. And even before you get to the American West, if you read anything about the settlements that took place in the Ohio Valley, or the ones that I'm the most familiar with, it wasn't uncommon for people to kill other people to take their stuff, and to cover it up in any number of ways or attribute it to other people. But I chose Murder at the Mission to pair with Holmes because I could imagine Holmes digging into this mystery and proving the truth of what actually happened. So, again, another potential novel idea for those of you that are writers. I've already introduced you to several books that deal with women in the West, but I would be remiss if I left out Outlawed, which really deals with lots of things that unfortunately are really pertinent to women in America and throughout the world today. Reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, it's all in there. And women are fighting to protect themselves and their bodies from male authority. And I've chosen to pair this with The Devil's Revolver, which in this case, it's women taking on the role of being violent and handling a gun. And of course, if you've done your literature classes, you know what kind of metaphors guns always lead to. So I thought that these two paired nicely together. Anna North's book is, of course, one of the key texts in showing just how much the Western can be expanded and how much it can do. So I look forward to seeing other books that follow in its footsteps and really challenge what we think of this genre. Somehow, in talking about the different creatures in the West, I managed not to talk about cows. And, you can't talk about the West without talking about the cows. That is, of course, the heart of Lonesome Dove, the cattle drive into the West. So if you want to read about the historical version of that, Cattle Kingdom by Christopher Knowlton is a good place to start. In fiction, Longhorns East by Boggs and The Cowboy and the Cossack by Huffaker. And I'm going to recommend Huffaker to you first because it actually takes place in Russia, so exporting the cowboy into a new space. So if maybe you just do not feel at all intrigued by the traditional Western, it's worth seeing how how Europe looks at cowboy culture. It's such a uniquely American thing. It's part of our mythos, and I think it's worth your time. This is one of the books that Nancy Pearl in Booklust sort of brought back into publication, and she wrote the introduction, I think, to the most recent version of it. She is a great place, a great resource for books that may have slipped off the radar. All right, we have reached the end of the Western. Hopefully, I have not made you feel like galloping off of a cliff, but rather have introduced you to some new titles that you at some point will be eager to check out. As always, please be kind and support your local libraries, your local booksellers, your indie booksellers if you are fortunate enough to have them. They can point you to even more titles that I have not yet discovered. If you feel that I have missed a favorite title of yours, or I have overlooked something in a grievous way, or I have mispronounced or misrepresented something, please let me know. I am still learning about so many things, so I do make mistakes, and I am always happy to acknowledge and correct those if they come up in our discussion together. I am also happy to help you find books. If there is something, a topic that you are interested in, and you kind of want to know what are some of the key titles surrounding that topic, you can always reach out to me. I'm also happy to dedicate an episode to something if there's something that you would like to see. So that was a lot of Westerns. The key takeaway that I'm leaving you with from episode 1, whether you were here or not, go read Lonesome Dove. It's amazing. Every single Western list I've ever found starts out with it, and it's for perfectly good reason. It will destroy your heart, but it is an amazing book and deserves your time. And I'm going to recommend that you read it with Shogun, which will also destroy your heart and do wonderful things. I'm still rooting for eventual Japanese Western hero. So if someone can make that happen, really looking forward to it. As always, thank you so much for letting me be part of your day, for tuning in. I hope that it is a wonderful day for you, and you can reach me at navalianlibrary@gmail.com if you have comments or questions or requests. I would love to hear from you. Happy reading.